Hey guys, welcome back to my stream. Uh, yeah, let's start the stream. Before we start, I would like to pray first. Mm. High concentration for doping some tools.
Thanks for stopping by. This is 2 Minute Classroom, and today we're talking about the plant cell. The plant cell is the most basic unit of life in all plants. Let's go through the major structures of the plant cell and touch briefly on the function of each.
Welcome to this informative video.
Thanks for stopping by. This is the most basic unit of life in all plants. Let's go through the major structures of the plant cell and touch briefly on the function of each. We'll start on the outside with the cell wall. The cell wall is a rigid structure made of cellulose that provides strength and structural support to the cell and plant as a whole. The cell wall is also permeable, meaning it allows fluid to move freely through it. This is not the cell membrane, which is our next structure. Cellulose that provides strength and structural support to the cell and plant as a whole. The cell wall is also permeable, meaning it allows fluid to move freely through it. This is not the cell membrane, which is our next structure. The cell membrane is what separates the cell from the environment outside the cell. It is also known as the phospholipid bilayer and has various structures to allow for selective inflow and outflow of water and other molecules and compounds. Next is the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is every and plant as a whole. The cell wall is also permeable, meaning it allows fluid to move freely through it. This is not the cell membrane, which is our next structure. The cell membrane is what separates the cell from the environment outside the cell. It is also known as the phospholipid bilayer and has various structures to allow for selective inflow and outflow of water and other molecules and compounds. Next is the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is everything within the confines of the cell membrane, including all organelles, proteins, and other structures. This is not the same as the cytosol, which is the fluid these organelles move around in. Plant cells have a large central vacuole, and this vacuole is used for storage, but it also plays a large role in plant shape and stability. It gives plants turgor pressure. Underwater plants don't have full central vacuoles and thus look limp or wilted. The Golgi apparatus or Golgi body is the packaging and shipping center of the cell. It modifies molecules and proteins produced by the cell and sends them in vesicles to be shipped out of the cell. Ribosomes are next, and they are small structures throughout the cell made up of proteins and RNA. They are responsible for translating RNA into proteins for use in and out of the cell. They are found freely floating in the cell or bound to the endoplasmic reticulum, and this is our next structure, and there are actually two types. Rough endoplasmic reticulum aids in the production and storage of proteins that are made on the ribosomes attached to it. It's these ribosomes that give it its rough texture and name. Proteins made in the rough ER are sent to the Golgi apparatus. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum, or smooth ER, does not contain ribosomes and is involved in the production of lipids and aids in detoxification. The nucleus is the center of the cell, not necessarily in location, but in function. This is where your DNA is stored and protected. The DNA is read by special proteins and transcribed into RNA to be translated into proteins. Information that comes out of the nucleus determines how the cell functions and, ultimately, how your genes are manifested. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. This is where cells and organisms get the energy to function. The mitochondria is the main producer of ATP, the energy currency of the cell. Similar to the mitochondria is the chloroplast. I say similar, but chloroplasts really work in an opposite manner. They convert energy from sunlight and use it to form basic carbohydrate compounds. This is really the source of usable energy for nearly all living organisms. The cytoskeleton is the structure and framework of the cell. It contains a vast infrastructure of microtubules and microfilaments. It gives cells their shape and structural support. The centrosomes are usually located near the nucleus and are responsible for the production of microtubules. They also play a critical role in mitosis, moving to the ends of the cell and helping it divide. So that's a quick crash course into the plant cell. If you've learned something, please like this video and subscribe for more great content. I love to respond to my comments, so please leave those below. Don't forget to check out my other videos, and I'll catch you next time.
He knows a lot about the science stuff. Plants are living organisms, so like any other organism on the planet, we know that they must be made of cells. And more importantly, plants are rather large multicellular organisms, so we should say they are made specifically of eukaryotic cells, just as all multicellular organisms are. As we learned in the biology series, eukaryotic cells have a variety of organelles inside, and most of these organelles are quite similar whether the cells belong to plants or animals. But we can identify plant cells very easily under a microscope because they have a few key differences. These would include the presence of chloroplasts, a central vacuole, and a cell wall, all of which are structures that are absent in animal cells. If you need to review general information about plant cells, visit my biology tutorial on the subject now, as well as the one on animal cells if you're rusty on organelle function and organization. Now, with the basics regarding plant cell structure understood, we need to get more specific. With animals such as ourselves, we have all kinds of different cell types that allow for the wide variety of organs and tissues in our bodies, as we learned in our study of human anatomy and physiology. Plants are precisely the same way, in that not all the cells in a plant are exactly the same. We can verify this just by looking at a tree. The roots, trunk, branches, and leaves are all made out of cells, but those cells look very different under a microscope, and they have very different jobs, just like our own nerve cells look very different from muscle cells, which look very different from skin cells, and so forth. Let's name the different types of plant cells and describe them now. First, there are the cells that plants use to grow. These are called meristematic cells, and they're very much like the stem cells we have in our own bodies. What this means is that meristematic cells are undifferentiated, or without a specific job assigned to them when they are first created through mitosis. So when meristematic cells divide and replicate, they can produce daughter cells belonging to any other kind of plant cell. The important difference between meristematic cells in plants and stem cells in animals is that meristematic cells don't get used up, so they can continue dividing and helping the plant grow indefinitely. Meristematic cells can be found in the tips of the roots, which are the parts of a plant that grow down into the soil, and in the tips of the shoots, which are the parts of a plant that grow up into the air. This means meristematic cells allow the roots of a plant to grow deeper into the soil and the branches of a plant to grow taller into the air. More specifically, they can be present in the apical or farthest position at the tips of roots and shoots, the lateral or side position within the vascular or transportation tissues of the plant, or in the intercalary position where branches intersect and where leaves attach to branches. The second type of plant cells, parenchyma cells, do most of the work within a plant, being that they're a sort of general use cell. Parenchyma cells are responsible for most of the photosynthesis that occurs, but they also do most of the energy and nutrient storage for the plant, as well as much of the nutrient transport. These cells have thin walls, no specialized structure, and come in a variety of shapes to support their diverse functions. In leaves, parenchyma cells form the two layers of mesophyll where photosynthesis and gas exchange take place. In roots and seeds, parenchyma cells are responsible for storing starch, fat, and water. Parenchyma cells also make up most of the structure of a fruit, and they create new structures to heal areas where a plant has been wounded. Collenchyma cells are the third type of plant cell, and they're a kind of backup system for the plant. These cells can contribute to photosynthesis and nutrient storage, but the most important job for collenchyma cells is providing flexible structure to the plant. Collenchyma are long cells that have thickened cell walls, meaning that when they're in a group, they act to make that part of the plant stiffer. You've probably eaten collenchyma cells before. In fact, the strings in celery are collenchyma cells. Groups of collenchyma cells can keep leaves from tearing, allow petioles, which are the little stems on the ends of leaves, to bend and flex in the breeze, and essentially give the plant some room to stretch without breaking. What's really amazing is that plants which experience a lot of bending due to wind or even artificial disturbance from a scientific researcher have parenchyma cells that can be up to twice as thick as normal. Even though parenchyma cells are pretty stiff in their structure, they're also very flexible and able to grow and change as the plant grows. However, parenchyma cells don't last forever. In woody plants, the parenchyma cells are only needed to do their job of stiffening and strengthening the plant until the sclerenchyma cells take over. The final type of plant cell, as we just mentioned, are the sclerenchyma, and these are a little different from the first three. Though sclerenchyma also have thickened cell walls like the parenchyma, the real difference is that sclerenchyma cells are dead and found in parts of the plant that are no longer growing. These sclerenchyma cells provide the most support for the plant by creating woody tissue in stems and trunks. Sclerenchyma cell walls contain lots of cellulose and lignin, which are both complex biopolymers that are difficult to break down, so they last a long time. These structural cells can be arranged in two basic ways. Sclerenchyma fibers are stretched lengthwise in a plant stem and provide most of a plant's support. These fibers are also what people use to make rope and fabric out of plants, such as flax.
It's 1665, and scientist Robert Hooke has just used his newly invented light microscope to look at a thin slice of cork up close. He's stunned to see that the tree bark is made up of thousands of tiny compartments, which he names for the little rooms that monks live in, called cells. He feverishly writes in his book, Micrographia, "They were indeed the first microscopical pores I ever saw, and perhaps that were ever seen, for I had not met with any writer or person that had made any mention of them before this." Which is 1665 speak for, whoa, did I just discover cells? I think I just discovered cells. And from that point on, scientists have never stopped studying them. Cells are a fundamental unit of all life on Earth that help us understand everything, from the teeniest microbes to the blubberiest whales. But botanists won't let you forget that the first cell ever discovered was from a plant. And hundreds of years later, we've learned more about these things and about ourselves than Robert Hooke could have ever imagined. Hi, I'm Alexis, and this is Crash Course Botany. While you might think that plants and animals don't have much in common, it turns out that our cells actually have a lot of similarities. First off, both plant and animal cells are surrounded by a barrier called a cell membrane that allows the cell to decide what kind of molecules it wants to let in or out. And both types of cells manufacture lots of proteins using ribosomes, which are the little granules spread throughout the cell, like the sprinkles in a funfetti cake. Those proteins have tons of different responsibilities in both animals and plants, like helping with immunity from disease and transporting nutrients. Plants and animals are also both eukaryotic organisms, meaning our cells contain organelles. And if you're thinking, hey, that just sounds like cute little organs, you're right. Organelles are functional units of the cell, just like organs are the functional units of our bodies. Like hearts and brains for us and stems and leaves for plants, organelles each have a unique job to do. On the other hand, prokaryotic organisms like bacteria lack organelles. So their cellular contents are a little more willy-nilly, like that junk drawer where you keep the chip clips and sauce packets. One key organelle that plant and animal cells share is the nucleus, the home of all our DNA. The nucleus uses the information stored in the DNA to tell the other parts of the cell what to do. It's like the coach of a sport ball team. And we can't forget Mitochondria, the kidney bean-shaped sites of cellular respiration in both plants and animal cells. And when we say respiration here, we don't mean the way humans breathe using our lungs. Cellular respiration is the process by which chemical energy stored in sugars is converted to energy molecules that fuel life's essential processes. So even though animals and plants get food in different ways, they all still have to perform respiration to convert their food to usable energy. But there are some pretty major differences between plant and animal cells. For one thing, plant cells contain chloroplasts, which are organelles that convert carbon dioxide gas from the air into sugars using energy from the sun, aka photosynthesis. You won't find chloroplasts in animals. They're more of a plant thing. You wouldn't understand, blobfish. And vacuoles are also more of a plant thing. They're fluid-filled organelles that maintain pressure in the plant cell to keep the plant from wilting. While some animal cells have small ones, as much as 90% of a plant cell's volume can be taken up by the vacuole. Vacuoles help cells grow, store proteins and sugars, and often contain colored pigments, so we have them to thank for the pretty pink petals on our roses. Plant cells are also surrounded by a thick cell wall made of cellulose, which is a carbon-containing molecule that is super abundant here on Earth. It's hard to comprehend just how much cellulose is on this planet. It's wrapped around every single cell of every single blade of grass, tree trunk, and superbloom. It's also stronger than steel and very economically important. Cotton and paper, for example, are made from cellulose. The cell wall also has profound implications for how plants build their bodies. In animals, when new cells are made from existing ones, the parent cell and resulting cells sort of pinch off from each other and go their separate ways. Maybe it'll stay close. Maybe it'll move across the country for college. An animal cell has to learn to make it on its own. But plant cells don't have that choice because of their cell walls. Their parent cells are a little more controlling. Instead of pinching off and saying goodbye, plant cells are forever locked in next to their parent cells. They do build a new permanent cellulose wall to separate parent cells from their offspring, though, so at least they're able to establish some boundaries. All this wall building among plant cells doesn't mean the parent and offspring will never speak again. They're still connected through tiny channels in their cell walls called plasmodesmata that allow them to communicate. In fact, the cytoplasm, or cell juice, is completely interconnected with all of the cells in a plant thanks to the plasmodesmata. They're like windows that plant cells can communicate through, telling each other how to respond to stimuli, or asking for the Wi-Fi password. So, those were a bunch of things that our cells don't have in common with plant cells. But there's another thing we do have in common, and that's hormones. That's right, plant cells are raging with them, just like an angsty preteen. Hormones are chemical signals that regulate growth and metabolism and make you want to say stuff like, "Ugh, Mom, get out of my room." We'll explore 5 major types of plant hormones, but beyond that, botanical researchers are still routinely discovering new ones. Let's start with ethylene, the only plant hormone that's a gas. It's one that humans have been using since way before we knew we were using it. Like in ancient Egypt, fig harvesters cut open underripe figs. In ancient China, farmers kept underripe pears near burning incense. And in East Africa and Samoa, people ripened bananas by burying them near a fire. 3 different techniques, all ethylene. But it wasn't until the 1890s that Russian plant physiologist Dmitry Nelyubov pinpointed ethylene as that ripening agent. He wanted to figure out why trees that grew next to gas street lamps would lose their leaves and get all distorted. So in his lab, he replicated and studied this effect in pea seedlings. And it turned out the ethylene released from burning gas lamps could keep plant cells from expanding, which is a huge part of plant growth.
The Philippines is one of the most interesting and overlooked countries in the world. It's currently home to one of the fastest growing economies in history, and it's achieving this very differently from other major players in the region like Thailand, Vietnam, and of course China. This collection of islands is home to 115 million people, which currently make up an overall very poor population with an output roughly a third of the global average, which is especially disappointing considering that the country has some of the greatest natural resource endowments in the region. But exploiting natural resources alone is not enough to make a country rich, and in many cases it can work against it, which is why the Philippines is so interesting. Some strange quirks of the nation's geography, political history, and culture mean that the country is catching up rapidly, and it's doing it in a way that could make it one of the most advanced economies in Asia, right in line with Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. It's doing this by leveraging its people as much as the resources it can dig out of the dirt. As the Southeast Asian region becomes more divided, the Philippines is becoming a stable and friendly enough country to do a lot of business, make a lot of products, and accommodate a lot of operations that are becoming too complicated to do in China. Of course, that doesn't mean that the country has a clear path to prosperity. It has a very long list of challenges, both internal and external, not least of which is the fact that it's both physically and metaphorically acting as a middleman between the USA and China. Beyond that, ongoing issues like corruption and uncertain political landscape and one of the most crushing forms of inequality a country can have are all immediate challenges that will need to be addressed. It's a lot. And that's before considering that the country's most promising industry may be rendered completely irrelevant by technological developments happening right now. So, what has fueled the Philippines' intense economic growth? Are these industries truly going to be sustainable in the coming decades? And finally, what are the challenges that could undo that progress? Once we've done all of that, we can put the Philippines on the Economics Explained leaderboard. No matter what kind of work you do, communication is important. Every email, proposal, script or report can speed up or slow down your organisation. This is where our sponsor Grammarly steps in to transform the way that we write and communicate so you can move. And all these AI features are free. Just sign up using that blank page. And all these AI features are free. Just sign up using my link at Grammarly.com to download Grammarly for free and start saving time on all your writing today. To say the Philippines Grammarly for free and start saving time on all your writing today. To say the Philippines has a unique relationship with the USA would be quite the understatement. As much as the US stimulates the Philippines' economy and has provided vital infrastructure, this dependency also opens the East Asian islands up to numerous complications. It started with its colonial history when the USA took over from Spanish rule in 1898. Uprisings throughout the Philippines against Spanish rulers became embroiled in the European countries' war with the USA, and the end result was the Spaniards releasing the colonies to them in exchange for $20 million, a not completely insignificant sum at the time. Despite cries for Filipino independence and resisting guerrilla fighters, the US ultimately voted in favour of using the archipelago as a foothold into Asian trade. That wasn't the explicit reason given at the time, but let's be honest, it's clearly a driving factor. However, to be a competitive trading hub, it required significant investments into infrastructure. This was the turn of the 20th century, when economic prosperity, more than ever, was being determined by mechanisation and modern infrastructure to support industries beyond just agriculture. Sponsorship from the US military began installing hospitals, renovating roads and funding bridges. One city to see a big overhaul was the capital of Manila. As the first few decades of the 20th century passed, America moulded the Philippines into its image. English became the dominant language, especially in governance and business, and the education system was overhauled to instill American values, even if it potentially came at the cost of its own cultural heritage. Now, of course, the USA wasn't doing this out of the kindness of their heart. Even back then, they saw the strategic importance of these islands, which made them a worthy investment, even if they couldn't claim them forever. After World War II, the US and the Philippines signed the Treaty of Manila on July 4th, 1946, whereby the Philippines became an independent republic. Sharing its day of independence with its former ruler, perhaps ironically, sums up how dependent the Philippines actually is on US support. Even to this day, the Philippines' political and economic interests are intertwined with the USA, whether they really like it or not. There is the hotly contested territorial dispute with China over the dominion of the South China Sea, and Japanese business investments have forged a strategic partnership with the Philippine government. This naturally means that any tensions between the Philippines and its neighbours or business partners are felt by the USA and vice versa. If the US has economic disputes with China, like trade routes in the South China Sea for example, then it will also play out in Philippine markets and boardrooms. If Japanese investors try to broker a new deal with the archipelago, then the US will be on hand to intervene at the behest of their former colonies' interests or their own. Yet the Philippines is a sovereign state, so it's expected to incur its own hardships with its own economy. This places the country in a precarious situation, where on one hand they rely on the US both to stimulate its economy and protect its geopolitical interests, while also showing that it's not an American lapdog. That's a tricky identity to navigate when the US personnel stationed in military bases contribute significantly to local business and commerce. Currently, just 500 US military personnel are based in the Philippines, but there are more bases due to be built in the near future, and the US pays handsomely for this foothold. Once the cost of salaries and benefits of Americans stationed overseas are factored in, then this practically becomes a form of indirect foreign aid because the US is indirectly sending money to the Philippines through their troops. Clearly, the Philippines has a complicated relationship with the United States of America at all levels of its economy. The big question is whether this entanglement is a gift or a curse, especially when the Philippines is used as a major hub for outsourcing, including by one of the world's biggest employers that most people have never heard of. It's called Accenture, and it's a self-described US multinational headquartered in Dublin, for reasons obviously not tax-related. According to Fortune magazine, its revenues in 2023 were an impressive $64.1 billion, and that's thanks to having 91 of the Fortune Global 100 companies amongst its client base. The company has 733,000 employees, with offices and operations in more than 200 cities across 49 countries, where it serves clients in more than 120 economies around the world. A big part of the company's operations are simple professional services provided by low-cost employees from countries where labour is much cheaper than the advanced economies it works for. Accenture has targeted the Philippines because of the nation's unique physical and political position, but above all else, its cultural history. For starters, Filipino workers are far more than just low-cost labourers. There are knowledge-based fields on offer like back-office work, call centres, and even creative fields like basic marketing and design. Such diverse opportunities help businesses find the most optimal cost-saving structure, so even if they're not manufacturers looking to fill overseas factories with cheap assembly workers, there's a lot of heavy lifting that can be done for them at a far lower cost in the Philippines. The likes of Amazon, American Express, Apple, Google, and even Wells Fargo firmly integrate the Philippines into their business structure. That means tens of billions of dollars have been generated thanks to the low-cost workforce of this country. But the question is, why? There are plenty of other, more competitive countries within a stone's throw, like China, Thailand, and even India, which has more English speakers than the Philippines has people. Yet, major global companies still choose here. The answer is simple but unintuitive. Decades of Western education, cultural influence, and work training means Filipinos can connect with Western clients in ways other Asian workers might not be able to. The high standards and regulatory practices also make them far more dependable, meanwhile the lower costs of labour outcompetes the workers from Western countries with similar features. Plus, there are the security concerns. Western companies are more inclined to hand over sensitive documents to Accenture or any other firm operating within the area than with their Chinese counterparts. Even India, another outsourcing hub, has had enough scandals and leaks within recent years to lose credibility in the eyes of potential business partners. In 2019, the telecommunications
Hello, my name is Will, and I scored perfectly on the digital SAT in this video here. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about yet another example of how the digital SAT writers trick you. Here's what I mean. In order to get the distribution of scores that the test writers are looking for, they have to have most people get the easy questions right, about half of people getting the medium questions right, and then a very small percentage of test takers getting the hardest questions right. And how do they write these hard questions? They can't just bring in new information that some students might know and that other students might not know. That's not necessarily very fair, and that's also not what they're testing for anyway. And so what they have to do to write these hard questions is to write questions that trick most test takers into selecting an incorrect rather than correct answer. Right here we have a good example of this. Previously, a classically non-fiction author published a fictitious novel. The author's new novel was blank by critics for its deep character development and intricate plot. Despite its length, readers found themselves engrossed in the story from start to finish. Now, a common pattern that you'll see in a lot of these questions is that two of the answer choices, or at least one, will obviously not be right. For example, D. The author's new novel was overlooked by critics for its deep character development. That doesn't make sense. How could you overlook something for the purpose of a thing that you would have to look at in order to understand? So D is obviously not right. And then furthermore, C is not right, because how could you criticize something that is inherently positive, for example, intricate plot or deep character development? How could the author's novel be criticized for positive things? Doesn't make any sense. But here's what's tricky, is that both examined and praised seem like they could be right. The author's new novel was examined by critics for its deep
mm, 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 mm.